So you're a leader and you've cast vision and you've clarified your core values and you've set clear objectives and goals for your team and you've set clear metrics for what success might look like. These are all really, really valuable things for us as leaders to provide for our teams to maximize and optimize our success. And yet, as you go down the road, you start feeling like your team is disengaged. You feel like they're lagging behind. You start to feel a bit of resistance on their part. They're starting to question you. Now you're starting to feel the weight of maybe they don't trust me. Maybe they're not into my vision. And before you know it, as a leader, it's so easy to start feeling like people just aren't with you or keeping up with you. And it's so important for us as leaders to understand that very often we interpret the experience of our teams and yet fail to consider how we're impacting our teams that may be leading to the experience that we're having.
So true. And how many times have we heard leaders say things like, I feel like I'm doing everything right, and yet my team feels checked out, or they're questioning me, or I don't feel like they
Yeah.
really care about what we're trying to accomplish here. So help us, Eric. What is happening underneath that when we start to feel that from our teams? What might be behind that?
Before I jump into what's beneath it, like into the systemic dynamics of what we often see leaders struggling with, it's also really important to just name the temptations. As a leader, it's tempting to either think, I'm a terrible leader, I'm not communicating clearly enough, which may be a possibility. You might be a terrible leader. You might not be communicating clearly, but for those of us who have done our best to communicate clearly, but when our teams are lagging behind, seem disinterested or disengaged, the temptation is either to think, I'm a terrible leader, I don't know how to do this. And so, or we get really, really upset with our team. And then we
Yeah.
start to try and, do command and control style leadership to get them moving in the direction we want them to. But I actually think once we understand what's going on beneath the surface, or what we have seen very often happening beneath the surface, actually the solve to this experience is far simpler, not easy, but simpler than I think we can imagine. So for a lot of leaders, Don, leaders assume that clarity equals connection. We have to remember that business is a team sport, that people are the engine of that business. And how people operate individually and collectively together is what's either going to give us the kind of power and endurance that we need, or is going to create a sap in our power, which is what we've been talking about. But in reality, people don't just hear what we say, so we can communicate clear vision, values, metrics, goals, and objectives, but they respond more often to how we make them feel. And if we're not aware of how we're communicating, our tone, our decisions, how we are engaging our people and how that's landing on them, then oftentimes what happens is there's a disconnect that starts to grow. And then we start as leaders to feel misunderstood, not valued, not respected, and ultimately not followed.
Mhm.
Our intent is good,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Times our engagement is less than. And so when we feel misunderstood, we start creating a narrative in our mind. They don't respect me. They're against me. They don't care. They're not as passionate as I am. All they are here to do is collect a paycheck. I mean, the number of times that we've heard leaders,
Right.
ventilate these kinds of suspicions about their team is obviously more often than we care to think about. But that's why we're doing a podcast episode of this. And then what happens is that narrative that we create about our teams in our minds starts to shape how we view our team and how we engage them. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Right.
We view our teams in a particular way, so we start handling them in a particular way, which then only drives the disconnect even deeper. And they're now going to start operating out of their experience of feeling disconnected, until it eventually bubbles up, and then we have the experiences of consistent turnover, or we rely on command and control styles of leadership, which in the short run might get some things done, but in the long run is absolutely a culture killer
Yeah.
in many contexts that we've operated in. And so, just here's a couple of thoughts. Number one, as leaders, we have to remember that part of our great privilege and responsibility is that we create the culture of our environments.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that more than by what we say, but by how we operate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Our prevailing attitudes and behaviors and how we engage with our team is what creates the culture, whatever our consistent engagement is. No matter how much we've clarified the vision, values, and all that other stuff. And so here's what I would say. If we as leaders want to feel understood, if we want to feel valued, if we want to feel that respect, that sense of I'm in this with you from your team, then we have to first create an environment where our team feels those same things from us.
Yeah.
And I just want our listener to just pause for a moment and let that sink in. As leaders, we cannot ask anything of our team with integrity that we are not first prepared to do for them. So if we want respect and honor, we want ownership, we want a sense of I'm in this with you, commitment, passion. If we want them to give that to us as a leader, we first have to give that to them as a leader.
Yeah.
Very, very, very powerful, right? And so, from the framework of our toolkit, we've talked about the EQ matrix in previous episodes, and obviously people can go back and listen. We have a whole episode just on the EQ matrix. When we're talking about emotional intelligence, part of emotional intelligence is, understanding ourselves more clearly, and we'll get to that. But really, it's about learning how to create an environment where people feel seen, heard, and valued. We talk about that through the lens of others awareness. How aware are we? Are we practicing conscientious, intentional awareness, right? Of the people around us, the environment, how people are experiencing the environment. Because very often as leaders, we're so caught up in what we're trying to accomplish that we're not paying a lot of attention into the culture and the environment that we want to drive that accomplishment. And so, when we're talking about others awareness, we're talking about the practice of empathy and listening and belief, which we can break down later if we want. But it's empathy, which is simply just understanding and appreciating life from our team members' perspective, right? And not imposing our view on them. Listening, the practice of curiosity and caring about where other people are coming from and their views and opinions and perspectives, even when we don't agree with them. And belief, which is, hey, these people might be struggling today, but I want to invest in them because I believe they can become a better version of themselves tomorrow. All of which are the antidote to the problem we started with.
That's right.
Right. This is the antidote that we're offering to our listeners to say, if we learn to practice empathy, listening, and belief in any context, in your marriage, with your kids, with your coworkers, with your boss, with your team members that you're leading, with your customers and clients, and it has this amazing effect of creating an environment where people feel seen, heard, and valued, which is a fundamental need for all human beings to feel safe and trusting. And that's actually what begins to create the space for people to feel ownership. I feel now I'm a participant in what we're fighting for rather than somebody who's just serving somebody else's vision. Right? Because nobody wants to be the minion, one of the 1,000 minions, with the visionary leader. We all want to feel there's some ownership. So would love, Dawn, as I'm sharing that, to hear kind of your thoughts, reflections.
Whew. Yeah. I mean, that's hitting deep. And I think it reminds me again of why the main struggle with leadership and in any context, it is that we are so tempted to find fault or when we're experiencing any sort of disruption, just human nature is to look at why that is somebody else's fault. And yet the antidote, as you said, is almost always to first stop and try to understand how you are contributing to that situation and what actions you can take that are going to alleviate that experience. This plays out daily in our families, in our workplaces, and we are so much better at at least observing and experiencing the behaviors and the reactions of others, and we often are incredibly anemic at doing that for ourselves.
That's right.
We do not take the time, we do not have the practice to say, "Wow, how did I come across in that situation?" Or what am I doing that's contributing to this vicious cycle that we're experiencing?"
That's right.
And simply pausing as the leader instead of falling into that trap, but engaging some simple tools that are really going to put you on a completely different trajectory.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
pause and practice others' awareness in this circumstance, and you think, how can I create an environment where my team feels seen, heard, and valued?
Mhm.
Where I'm practicing empathy, which, by the way, doesn't mean that I just agree with everything they say.
That's right.
I can feel empathetic and still disagree with you.
Mhm. 100%. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that the the opportunity for us as leaders when we're experiencing people that we're partnering with who seem disengaged, disinterested, distrusting, whatever, aloof,
Yeah.
resistant, is the temptation is it's like is to pull on that chain harder,
Yeah.
right? A dog who's not doing what you want it to do. So I'm going to yank that their leash harder. And that goes back to that command and control style leadership. But really, the opportunity is to be proactive. And proactivity always starts with us taking 100% responsibility for ourselves. Like, how am I potentially contributing to this environment? Is what I hear you saying,
Yeah.
which is so
Exactly.
powerful because as leaders, let's be honest, it's just easier to blame everybody else for why things aren't going and why people aren't working the way we want them to work,
Yeah.
and to crack the whip even harder, to threaten them with, well, I don't know if you're going to work out here. And let's be honest, like let's make sure we leave room for the fact that there are times when we will have team members who are lagging, and it's not our fault. There will be times when team members are resistant or difficult, and that may not be because of us as leaders. But the first thing we have to do as leaders is to consider, am I creating an environment or what we call a culture, the air we breathe, in which people feel like they can participate in, right, whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish, rather than being somebody who's just a cog in a machine, which is really, really, really important.
So let's turn the corner to some practical stuff here, because we can all understand that this isn't just a leadership reality, it's a people reality. It's a reality of being a person that we tend to look outside of ourselves first before looking inward for the causes of certain problems. But if a leader is feeling misunderstood, what can they do to actually take some steps to change that without just continually shouting at their people to just trust me?
Yeah.
That doesn't tend to so good.
Just do what I say.
Right.
Oh gosh, it reminds me of the household I grew up in. And the control style of leadership. Yeah, let's make this really simple. Again, not easy, but simple. I think for us as leaders, and you mentioned this earlier, it's the discipline of taking time to reflect on, am I as a leader practicing these three skills of others awareness, empathy, listening, and belief? And we've talked about this in other episodes, the importance of getting outside feedback, because oftentimes, we have a limited view of ourselves and how we're operating, and even more importantly, how we're impacting our environment. And so it's the reason I constantly recommend to anybody in any leadership context to find people they trust. These are mentors. These are people, even in their workspace, that they really trust, to say, hey, help me. Where am I practicing empathy, listening, and belief really well with my team? Where am I potentially struggling or not doing that well? Because more often than not, that's where the problem lies, right? And and I think that, you know checking ourselves for, how much am I telling versus how much am I asking, right? So we're talking about the skills of curiosity and asking lots of questions and trying to understand what's going on in a situation, versus just coming in and saying, this needs to be better, that needs to be better, this needs to be different. Like, why haven't you done this yet? Like, come on, I've told you 100 times, which is, again, that's kind of an easy default for many of us, especially under pressure when we've got a lot going on,
Oh,
and
yeah.
feel that. Maybe instead of assuming that we're misunderstood, considering how we're being experienced, right? Because
Mhm.
very often our feeling of feeling misunderstood, I know in my own marriage and with, with other important relationships, more often than not is a result of how I'm engaging in those relationships, right? So just considering the possibility that maybe they're not misunderstanding us, but we're operating in a way that's making it difficult for them and to not only understand us, but to get on our side, to be our advocates, to be on our team. And again, you might even dare to ask for feedback from people you trust, or even team members. Say to pull a team member aside and say, "Hey, listen, I would love to hear from you. This is something as a leader that I'm really committed to trying to do to create this environment where you guys feel seen, heard, and valued, where you guys feel like you have ownership in this adventure that we're on together, that we win together and we lose together. So, you know, when it comes to these three skills of empathy, listening, belief, where do you feel like I'm doing well? Where do you see I can maybe do a little bit better?"
Mhm.
Easy way to solicit feedback, because I found that when you're asking, especially people on your team, people who might be below you on the organizational chart, that inviting them to share some positive feedback makes it easier for them then to add just a little bit of more critical.
Yes.
And now that I've told my boss or my superior, or my leader, some good things, now I feel safe to kind of add, there's a couple of things that might you could do a little better, we'll see. So I think that's really important. And then again, we always remind ourselves and others to lead with curiosity. And again,
Mhm.
curiosity takes time. It takes energy to create space to better understand the situation, what people are experiencing, the challenges that are going on, whether with a project, with whatever stuff that we're dealing with. It takes time. And yet here's what I find, it's kind of like that old adage, measure twice and cut once,
Yeah.
right? Let's do the work so that we're not, we're not adding unnecessary work to our plate. And we're not making mistakes. I think as leaders, we're so action oriented. We want to just kind of move on to the next thing, that I think we don't measure twice. We don't really try to understand the situation. And therefore, we oftentimes will, in our reactive posture, make decisions, bark orders, challenge people, command and control. We operate in a way that is actually counterproductive to what we're trying to achieve. But the little bit of time to practice curiosity, to ask questions, to understand, to invite other people's perspectives, usually begins to unlock the clarity we need as a leader to be able to now be proactive and make good decisions that are probably in our best interest.
That's right. And it makes me think of, well, we as a team always try to embody the reality of these experiences, noting that we don't get it perfect, but we are committed to living these things out. And so it makes me think of a time that you and I actually got stuck in this pattern
Mm,
where we weren't communicating well. And we both started making up stories. You started wondering if I was pulling my weight. I started wondering if I had any longevity with the company. And you were, we were forced into a situation where we had to sit down and have that conversation. And it was incredible. One, the stories that we had each been able to make left to our own devices because
like
we
the
weren't,
narratives that we had created about each other and ourselves. Yeah, yeah, that were
yes,
unhelpful. Yeah.
because we weren't practicing others' awareness
Yeah.
and because we weren't being curious. We were not leading with curiosity. We were creating those stories and just being like, yep, that must be how it is. And yet we sat down. I remember we sat down in a Starbucks and
Yeah.
we had to have a hard conversation. And there was opportunity for both listening and sharing criticisms and all of that. But the action of coming together and actually considering how we were being experienced by the other person led us to a place of being able to reconnect and commit to how we were going to move forward together.
Yeah. I remember two things specifically about that experience. One was that I remember as you were sharing about your perspective of your experience over I think the previous like 8 or 9 months,
Mhm.
I, it was both humbling but also incredibly insightful in terms of helping me understand that, wow, the way that I was leading was creating an experience for you that was, I knew right away that's unhelpful. I think in particular, you were challenging the fact that I was constantly pivoting and moving in a different direction over and over and over again. You're like, Eric, man, you've got me working on 6,000 projects and I can only do so many of those at one time. And that was that was really helpful for me to learn more about one of my leadership deficiencies. Um, but also, as you shared, it actually increased my sense of compassion and understanding and appreciation for what you were fighting through.
Mhm.
Um, and and I think coming out on the back end of that conversation, feeling here's what I experienced, which is what we're constantly coaching our leaders in.
Yeah.
I think what happened is we found a reconnection at a human level.
Yes.
Right, we talk a lot about the importance of prioritizing human connection because business is a team sport, and so how people
Right.
connect together, which is no different to any other team engagement. We reconnected at a human level, like we could see and appreciate each other and
Right.
value one another in a new and fresh way. It also undid, or like, what's the right word? It undid the distorted views, at least
Yeah.
for me, that I had
Um,
developed subconsciously because of how I was just projecting onto you what I was from what my experience was.
yeah.
And so it just it crushed those, which is happening. How many times that's happened in my marriage where I finally have that conversation with my wife that I've been not wanting to have and avoiding, and then all my the frustration compounds, and now I've got this whole narrative of her in my brain that every time I see her, I treat her through that narrative. And then we have the conversation, and I'm like, I'm so sorry that I viewed you this way and I projected this onto you, and I was so in. And then now I see her through fresh eyes, and I'm like, I love you. You're the most amazing wife and person ever. But we don't realize how quickly we develop these, what I would call these negative biased narratives,
Mhm.
now cause us to just push somebody into a corner. So no matter what they do, it's just going to reinforce our negative view of them. I remember that happening. That was really powerful. I remember in a fresh way, I remember walking out of that Starbucks feeling like, Dawn's the best person ever. She's amazing. I can't believe she stayed with me. But all because we just worked hard to say, how do we
Yeah.
hear and value one another? And it also led to some really powerful changes in how we work together, and me knowing how to say, okay, I don't want to change direction anymore. Like, you hold the steering wheel and keep us going in the right direction. I trust you. And that's when Aura came in. But just so many benefits that came out of one conversation
Yes.
that's truly probably saved our working relationship.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we share that because as a team, we are always fighting for these things and we always value authenticity. And so we want for our listeners to see that we are actually working these things out in real time all the time.
Question, is it humbling as ever? It'd be so much easier to just be the like answer people. Like, we've got these principles and tools and they're amazing and you can do it too. And but this journey of how we've chosen to operate as a business and as a culture is to say, hey, we want to make sure that we're leading and coaching out of the overflow of our own experiences and journey, which is really powerful. I also always tell my clients, listen, you cannot be more messed up than me. If this stuff works for me, then it will work for you.
Hey, well, that's right. And it's a reminder. It's a reminder of something that we, like you just said, we share all the time. Leadership is not about being perfect. You don't need to be perfect to
Yeah.
be understood. The key component is being present. It's opening that space for honesty, and it's being willing to learn how your behaviors are landing for others. That is the space where trust grows.
Yeah. So let me just capitalize on that, and I want to hit this home because I think this episode's really, really important because we're experiencing these challenges in any relational partnership that we're engaged with, right?
Yeah.
At some level. We want buy-in. We want people to have ownership of within their part of the partnership. And that is driven by our willingness to prioritize human connection, which quite frankly for generations has not been promoted or encouraged within the workplace. I want to give a little shout out to our younger generations of people who are coming to the workplace and saying, this sucks. I don't
Yeah.
want to be clogging your machine. A paycheck isn't enough value for me to want to spend the, 3/4 of my life in this workspace. And yeah, and I just think that there is a revolution happening within all workspaces where the younger generation is pushing the older generations to say, hey, relationship matters, human connection matters, how you make me feel. Now, again, I know that's double-sided, right? Both parties are responsible in that.
Yep.
However, our willingness as leaders, and I can say this from experience, the leaders we've had the privilege of working with over now many years who've really embraced this understanding that the stories we hear is that not only is this transforming their workplace relationships, people want to be a part of it, they feel ownership, they're advocates now, they're on the bus, they're excited, they're passionate, they're giving more of their time and energy. Not only is it transforming workplace communities, it's also, we hear stories of how it's transforming people's personal lives, their marriages, their significant others, their relationship with their kids, with their extended family. It's really powerful.
It is. And it's because when everything is said and done, the only thing that we actually have control over is how we choose to show up. And that starts with understanding how we currently are showing up and then making choices to change, to make that to show up differently for our people and for our families.
I agree. So we jump into maybe some simple practical handles of how our listeners can maybe step into this
Let's do it.
in their own lives. Yeah, awesome. So here's some thoughts. So this week for our listeners, just notice try to pay attention to where you're spending more time telling than asking. And this could be in any context of your life, personal or professional. Where are you spending more time telling than asking? That's really important. Instead of assuming that we're misunderstood and then taking on the victim or villain mindset, which we've talked about, consider the possibility of how people are experiencing us and that might be contributing to why they're behaving in ways that are unfavorable. Dare to ask for feedback from those that you trust. It's scary, but dare to ask for some feedback, to check your blind spots and ask other people, hey, how am I operating? Where is it helpful? Where is it unhelpful? Or specifically talking about, empathy, listening, and belief. Where do you feel like I practice these well in our partnership? And where do you think there's maybe a little bit of room to grow? And then I think I love what's written down here: to battle against what I would call the blame game and assuming that everybody is against us, and instead leading with curiosity. If somebody's not operating in the way that we would want of them, that we think is the better version of them, to be, instead of being angry and caustic and condemning or penal, to instead lead with curiosity, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to be quite honest with our listeners, we took this episode in a slightly different direction, but I love where I love where that personal story kind of took us in this. So as always, thank you for joining us. And if this episode gave you something to think about, pass it along to a leader who's working through the same thing. And next episode, we will be talking about what happens when you're trying to lead without personal clarity and why that never works. So we will see you next time.